The smell was always the first thing she noticed. Not the sharp acidity of lemon zest or the warmth of buttered brioche, but something deeper, older. It was the scent of exclusion, dressed in luxury. Leather-bound menus, white tablecloths too pristine to touch, wine racks that whispered old money with every bottle. Amina had walked past places like this her whole life, not because she couldn't go in, but because they never truly opened the door. There were no signs that said don't enter. There didn't have to be. Everything about establishments like this one was designed to communicate belonging through absence. Absence of people like her, absence of her accent, absence of her laugh that sometimes echoed too loudly in places that preferred quiet superiority. She had grown up just 10 blocks away from that restaurant, in an apartment where the windows never fully closed and the heat worked when it wanted to. Her mother taught her how to stretch a bag of rice into a week's worth of meals, how to turn stale bread into something warm and healing, how to survive on little and still give more. The first kitchen Amina learned in had no marble countertops or brushed steel appliances. It had one pot, a chipped cutting board, and her mother's hands, moving with grace and exhaustion. By 16, Amina was recreating dishes she saw on YouTube, improvising techniques with whatever was left in the fridge. She cooked not because she wanted to impress, but because it was the only space where her voice wasn't corrected, her presence wasn't questioned. Food had never judged her. It had never asked her to be less. It just responded. And still, when she was accepted into culinary school, she hesitated to tell anyone. Her mother was proud, of course, but pride didn't pay tuition. Amina worked every night, washing dishes in the very restaurants that had never invited her to sit down. She memorized the language of chefs who never learned her name, who barked instructions in French and ignored the girl in the back scrubbing pots until her fingers blistered. She never resented the work, but she never forgot the tone. The way some kitchens used language as a weapon. The way hosts smirked when her delivery uniform bore no logo. The way guests assumed she was there to fix something broken, not to build something new. Years passed. She built anyway. With scraped savings and borrowed faith, Amina launched a meal kit company from her apartment. It started with hand-packed boxes, menus she printed herself, and a website held together with more luck than code. But what she lacked in flash, she made up for in flavor, dishes born from memory and translated into accessibility. Real food, real ingredients, real people. She fed communities that had been ignored by every premium brand. She delivered to neighborhoods skipped by delivery apps. Her name spread not through ads, but through gratitude. And slowly, her company grew from kitchen to cloud kitchen, from crates to commercial space, from side hustle to startup. And one day, her phone rang. It wasn't a customer. It was a broker. A small, upscale bistro in her city, the kind of place that posted Michelin dreams but paid minimum wage, was failing. Quietly, desperately. The reviews were strong, but the cash flow wasn't. The owner wanted to sell discreetly, to someone with vision and capital but without the kind of ego that might make headlines. She said she'd think about it. She didn't. That restaurant, Le Noyer, was not just any restaurant. It was the restaurant. The one that had rejected her before she could finish her sentence. The one that had let her stand in the lobby soaked in rain, only to be told with perfect pronunciation that she was not welcome, that she was not their kind. They didn't know her name. They hadn't cared. But her name was now on the LOI, the letter of intent. And the ink was almost dry. The irony didn't thrill her. It sobered her. Because she knew that buying the place wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't stop the next version of that maitre d' from turning away someone who didn't match the unspoken dress code of pedigree. Ownership didn't automatically change culture. But it was a start. And so she signed. Not to take revenge. To take space. To take up the space they said wasn't hers. And quietly, while the restaurant carried on as usual, white napkins, imported olive oil, laminated prestige, she began to plan the quiet transformation. The one they wouldn't see coming. The one she owed not just to herself, but to every girl who'd ever been told, "We don't serve people like you." The building didn't blink. It didn't shake when the papers were signed. The sidewalk didn't tremble beneath the new name that had silently entered the records of ownership. No camera crews arrived. No headline broke the illusion of normalcy. The restaurant simply went on serving plates on polished stoneware, pairing wines with curated accents, and ignoring what had shifted beneath its very foundation. Amina didn't expect celebration. She didn't want it. She watched quietly from a distance in the days after the contract closed, still walking past the windows, still receiving the same empty glances from the staff inside. They never recognized her. Not once. She was still the same figure on the other side of the glass. Still the outsider, the invisible. But the keys in her pocket whispered otherwise. She didn't enter. Not yet. Instead, she studied the place like a surgeon studies a failing organ. She counted the seconds it took to be greeted at the door, timed how long guests waited for water, noted the subtle changes in expression between customers who wore branded collars and those who didn't. She observed where the eye was drawn, toward the bar, where only a certain kind of body was allowed to linger, toward the private room, where business deals were struck over foie gras and soft jazz. She paid attention to details the current staff no longer saw. And she saw what they didn't, not just what the space had become, but what it had stopped being. The kitchen moved like a machine, but no one inside it smiled. The line cooks worked with precision but without joy. The servers held posture like armor, but their eyes were vacant. No one laughed. No one breathed fully. The restaurant was functioning, but it was hollow. Beautiful on the outside, brittle beneath the surface. That brittleness was an opportunity. Her first move wasn't public. She changed the supplier contracts. Gone were the overpriced specialty vendors chosen more for optics than taste. In came local growers she had met through years of small business networking. People who harvested with their hands and remembered her name. She replaced imported bread with a deal from a third-generation baker who still needed dough at 4 a.m. each morning. She reduced costs without slashing quality. And in doing so, she built something sacred: loyalty. Then came the staff audits. Anonymous surveys. Quiet interviews. A long-forgotten host whispered about the microaggressions behind closed doors. A busser confessed how often he was told to fade into the background during service. A former line cook, now long gone, sent her an email thanking her. Not for hiring him, but for finally asking what it had been like to work there. She took it all in. She didn't rage. She didn't purge. She documented. Because before you fix something, you have to know where it bleeds. Amina spent nights at home drafting policy. Not just about food. About dignity. About how this place would and would not operate under her name. No more vibe screening at the front desk. No more grooming standards built around whiteness. No more wine lists that intimidated instead of welcomed. No more chefs who shouted just to feel powerful. This wouldn't be a revolution. It would be a recalibration. And still, she didn't walk through the front door. Not yet. She let the old rhythms stumble on. Let them believe the building was still theirs. And then, one morning before the doors opened, she arrived early. She used the key herself, unlocked the door in silence, stepped inside the space that had once denied her, not as a guest, but as a woman reshaping the blueprint beneath every table, every chair, every breath of air between course and candlelight. She stood in the center of the dining room while the lights were still dim, while the floors had not yet been mopped, and she listened not for sound, but for something deeper, the potential, the reckoning, the quiet before the renovation of everything. And when the first staff member walked in, coat over shoulder, phone in hand, distracted by routine, they looked up and saw her, not as a guest, not as a stranger, not as the girl they once turned away, but as the owner. And nothing, from that moment forward, would taste the same again. The first full day of ownership passed like a shadow, quiet, still, almost ceremonial in its restraint. Amina didn't arrive with announcements or thunder. She didn't summon the entire staff into the dining room for a speech. There was no applause, no moment of revelation, no call for acknowledgement. She simply walked in, and everything around her bent to the fact that she was no longer someone the room was allowed to ignore. The morning crew noticed first. A barback paused mid-step, unsure whether to address her. The pastry assistant whispered to a colleague, confusion barely hidden beneath their breath. But no one asked directly. It wasn't fear that kept them quiet. It was uncertainty. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She didn't carry a clipboard. She didn't move with the performative command so many owners mimicked. She just stood near the host's podium, watching, listening. And the walls, for the first time in a long time, began to listen too. They had absorbed years of selective kindness. Years of greetings that were warmer for some and clipped for others. Years of laughter only shared in the safety of uniform sameness. Amina could feel it, the weight of layered behavior, embedded like dust between floorboards. But she also saw what most people missed: the cracks. The places where old habits had already begun to weaken. At mid-morning, she entered the kitchen. Not with a clipboard, with her sleeves rolled. She asked for a prep list. Not to give instructions, but to help. At first, the team hesitated. Not out of disrespect, out of confusion. No one could remember a time when an owner had helped slice mushrooms, or peeled garlic, or cleaned downline after service. But Amina had done it before, long before this place, in kitchens that were barely lit, with knives borrowed from secondhand stores. Her fingers knew how to fold into the rhythm. She didn't need attention. She needed intention. She stayed quiet. Let the crew adjust to her presence. Let them test her silence. Probe it with side glances, assumptions, curiosity. And then someone broke. Not with words, with gratitude. A prep cook, no older than 19, slid her a container of finished mise en place. Their fingers brushed. Nothing was said, but something passed between them. Recognition. The kind of recognition born from shared history. Two people who had both stood outside kitchens like this and wondered what it would feel like to be seen. By late afternoon, the news had begun to spread. They didn't know everything, but they knew enough. She owned it. Not just the building, the brand, the future. She was the one who signed paychecks now. The one who made it possible for lights to turn on, ovens to heat, ingredients to arrive. And yet she didn't move any differently. She still poured her own coffee, still nodded instead of barking commands, still picked up napkins dropped by distracted hands. The evening shift arrived tense. The old maitre d', the one who had once told her, "We don't serve people like you," wasn't on the floor anymore. Gone. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. In his place stood a young man with a posture that carried less arrogance, more curiosity. He smiled at her without performance. She nodded back without ceremony. Service that night was clean, efficient, but different, not because anything changed on the menu, but because the atmosphere no longer trembled beneath old rules. A couple entered late, no reservation, no fancy clothes. In the past, they would have been turned away gently but firmly. This time, they were seated. No fuss, no filters. Amina watched it all from the bar. She wasn't inspecting. She was absorbing. She was making sure that this place, the place that had once refused her a chair, learned how to be a place where others didn't have to beg for one. By closing time, she was the last to leave. She walked through the empty dining room, chairs turned up, floor mopped to shine. Her reflection followed her in the glass of the front door. But it didn't look like vengeance. It didn't look like victory. It looked like ownership. Quiet. Absolute. And earned. Before the doors opened the next day, she was already inside. No cameras. No PR rollouts. Just a woman at a table near the window, flipping through a menu that once refused her hands. She studied it like a living document, tracing each word as if it were evidence. The descriptions were elegant. French techniques wrapped in foreign terms. Ingredients imported from oceans away. Dishes priced not by value, but by perception. Amina closed the menu and slid it aside. She had never tasted the food here. Not then. Not after the insult. Not even when she became the owner. There had always been something sacred about refusing that bite, as if swallowing their invention would have meant accepting their rejection. But today it wasn't theirs anymore. The first tasting she ordered wasn't for show. It was for memory. She sat in silence as the first dish arrived. Seared scallops stacked on purees and microgreens arranged with surgical care. She took a bite. Chewed slowly. Thoughtfully. The flavors were precise but disconnected. Nothing bold. Nothing personal. Like a speech written by committee, technically perfect, emotionally empty. She tasted the next course. And the next. Each one confirmed the same suspicion. This was food designed to be photographed, not remembered. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't alive. In the kitchen, she watched from the corner as the staff peeked out, unsure of her reactions, unsure of her expectations. She gave nothing away. Not a word. Not a gesture. Just an even gaze and steady hands. After the last plate was cleared, she asked for the chef's notes. Recipes. Sourcing. Philosophy. She reviewed everything. No fury. Just clarity. And the next day, the work began. Not with scissors. With questions. She met with every station. Not to evaluate, but to listen. She asked where they sourced produce. Which dishes they hated making. What they wished was on the menu. Some looked confused. Others hesitated. A few opened up. The youngest line cook, a woman whose father ran a corner market in Queens, offered a family stew recipe. Spices layered in memory, not measurement. Another prep cook quietly described his grandmother's rice technique, the burn at the bottom of the pot, not an accident, but a prize. She wrote it all down. And began to rewrite the menu, not just what it served, but why. Gone were the overwritten entrees trying to impress. In their place, warmth, intention, voice. The new dishes didn't abandon technique. They layered it with heritage. Elevated without erasing. Refined without forgetting. The wine list changed too. Now it featured Black-owned vineyards. Latin American biodynamic labels. Indigenous growers from dusty hillsides no critic had ever written about. Sommeliers weren't asked to memorize regions, they were asked to understand stories. Every decision fed the next. She brought in new vendors not because they were cheaper, but because they knew how to greet a delivery driver with the same respect they gave a buyer. She hired a food historian. Not for optics. For roots. She worked late. Not in the office. In the kitchen. Tasting. Balancing. Failing. Rebuilding. She cooked the rice 3 times before it reminded her of home. She stayed with the pastry chef until the crust cracked with memory. She walked the walk-in fridge with a clipboard and no ego. And every day, the restaurant began to exhale. The staff breathed easier. Their voices grew louder, clearer. A dish they once feared to suggest now became the house special. A garnish once dismissed was now plated with pride. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And then, without ceremony, the new menu launched. No press. No influencer campaign. Just ink on a page. The night it debuted, a family walked in. No reservation. No formalware. Just 3 generations holding hands and sharing space. They were seated without hesitation. Served without assumptions. Amina stood in the back, apron smudged, clipboard forgotten. She watched as they tasted something that came from her memories. From her table. From the silence of every kitchen she was once excluded from. And for the first time since she stepped into this building, she tasted too. Not just the food. The place. And it was hers. Now it was ready to feed people like her. Because that was the whole point. The wind had shifted by the time the restaurant reopened fully under the new vision. It wasn't just the air outside, it was the atmosphere within. There was a new rhythm, a new density to the silence, as if the walls themselves were leaning forward to listen. By now, the staff knew. Not just who Amina was, but what she had done. They had seen the changes come piece by piece, not as orders from above, but as choices made beside them, shoulder to shoulder. She didn't command respect. She planted it. Watered it. Let it grow through the cracks of everything the old place had paved over. But the guests, they were slower to learn. Many were the same faces. Suits and heels, expensive cologne and borrowed confidence. They came expecting the same curated experience, the same voices to greet them, the same white plates to arrive in the same order with the same adjectives attached. For some, nothing had changed. Until one particular night. The dining room was full. The room glowed with evening light bouncing off glass and bronze. Tables were set with linen and low candles. There was laughter, yes, but also tension. A couple had entered moments before. Older. Well-dressed. The kind who had grown used to ownership without needing to own anything at all. They had reservations. But not for what they would find. They asked questions not out of interest, but control. About the new menu. About the changed wine list. About the staff. Their tone was curious in the way a blade is curious, meant to test the skin. They asked to see the owner. They wanted to thank her, they said. But the host paused. Because she knew what they meant. Not just a name, a shape. A silhouette in their imagination that didn't match the one she would call forth. Still, she went to the kitchen. Amina was plating. When the host approached, Amina didn't sigh. Didn't roll her eyes. She wiped her hands, set her towel aside, and walked calmly into the dining room. The couple watched her approach with interest, until they saw her face. Their posture changed. Slightly. The subtle widening of eyes. The pause in speech. The recalibration. It was quick, but not quick enough to go unnoticed. Amina didn't flinch. She arrived at the table and stood still. She said nothing. She didn't need to, because in that moment everything became clear. She was not what they expected, but she was everything they had come to taste. The dishes before them, born from her palate, her past, her people. The staff around them, shaped by her leadership. The wine they swirled, sourced through her networks. They sat in a room they had once believed belonged to people like them. Now they sat in a space rebuilt by someone they would have once looked past. The man cleared his throat, said something faintly complimentary. The woman nodded too quickly, smiled too hard. They tried to pivot, regain footing. But Amina didn't respond. She simply smiled gently, clearly, and walked away. Back to the kitchen. Back to her post. Because the purpose wasn't to teach them. The purpose was to feed everyone without needing to prove anything. The meal went on. And across the restaurant, those who had always wondered if they belonged saw what they needed to see. Her. In command. Without apology. Without costume. Amina stayed at the pass that night until the last order went out. She reviewed inventory. Checked in on her team. Helped wipe down the prep tables. She didn't celebrate. She didn't exhale. She simply moved forward. Because nights like this were not ends. They were thresholds. Proof that the door stayed open now. For everyone. Morning light came through the east-facing windows with a softness that made the tables look less like stages and more like places to gather. The restaurant, empty of people but full of possibility, stood quiet. Still. Not waiting to be filled, but ready, truly ready, in a way it had never been before. Amina unlocked the front door herself, even though she didn't have to anymore. She still arrived before the first cook. Still turned on the lights by hand. Still walked the floor, fingertips brushing over linen, eyes catching things no checklist could. Not out of habit. Out of ritual. Because every morning was a reminder this place once rejected her. Now it breathed because she allowed it. The headlines had started to find her. A few press outlets had heard rumblings of change. Black woman quietly buys the restaurant that once turned her away, the kind of headline that generated clicks and outrage. But Amina declined every interview. She let the story live without her commentary. Because the point was never what they had done to her. The point was what she had built in response. She watched the reservations list grow each week, not with influencers, but with families. Teachers. Artists. Couples from neighborhoods that had never appeared on the restaurant's old delivery map. People came because they felt something different when they stepped inside, not just a change in decor or menu, but a shift in spirit. The staff stayed longer now. No one whispered about corporate. No one tiptoed through shifts hoping not to be noticed. They smiled not as service, but as presence. They held doors for each other. They shared recipes. They tasted new dishes together like they were stories, not products. And every once in a while, a young girl walked in with wide eyes and uncertain steps, just like Amina had once done, years ago, outside places like this. But now, she was the one welcoming them in. One evening, long after close, Amina stood by the host stand. The lights were dim. The music low. Her staff had gone home. The kitchen was spotless, and the dining room carried that sacred quiet known only to those who love food enough to stay late after it's gone. She opened the reservation book. Not the digital system, the leather-bound one she kept for herself. She flipped through pages filled with names, notes, laughter scribbled in the margins. Every table was a memory. Every name a reminder that this place had stopped being about who was allowed in and started being about who was welcomed home. She ran her hand across the final page of the current week. In the margin, one of her hosts had written, "That guest came back again, the one who cried during dessert." She closed the book softly. There was nothing else to prove. The restaurant no longer carried her name in neon. It didn't have her photo on the wall. But it bore her fingerprints in every softened policy, every warm greeting, every plate that told the truth of flavor born from life. This wasn't just a business anymore. It was reclamation. It was presence. It was resistance served on porcelain. She looked at the door. The same door where they once told her, "We don't serve people like you." Now that door stayed open. Not because someone held it. Because she never let it close again. And she wouldn't. Ever.